My hands don't work the way they used to, she told him, the first morning he showed up at her door. So if you break something, I may not be able to throw you out myself. He didn't laugh. He just looked at her hands, the left one wrapped in a compression glove, the right one curled slightly inward at the fingers, and said, "Then I'll make sure I don't break anything." That was how it started. Elara Dunmore had spent 11 years building Meridian Capital into one of the most respected private equity firms in Toronto. She had done it with a damaged nervous system, a stubbornness that her late mother had called genetic, and a reputation for reading a balance sheet the way other people read faces, instinctively, completely, without being fooled by surface presentation. What she could not do, as of 8 months ago, was button her own jacket. The neurologist had a name for what was happening. Elara had stopped using it because she found that the moment she said the word out loud, people's expressions changed. They went soft in a way she didn't want directed at her. The condition was progressive but manageable, he'd said. With the right support, she could continue to work, continue to live independently, continue to do most of what she'd always done. Most was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. She had bought the Rosedale property 6 years ago, before the diagnosis, when the house's original Victorian bones and 3-story layout had seemed like features rather than obstacles. Now the back staircase had a handrail she never should have had to request at 41. The kitchen had been partially retrofitted, and the elevator, a small residential lift installed by the previous owners in the East Wing, had been broken for going on 3 weeks, which meant that the 3rd floor, where her home office sat, had effectively become inaccessible. Her assistant had found someone. She hadn't asked many questions about who. The truck that pulled into her driveway at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning was a white Dodge Ram with a dented rear panel and a Quebec plate sticker that had been partially peeled off and reapplied crookedly. The man who got out of it was not what she expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad-shouldered in a practical rather than performative way, with the kind of forearms that came from actual work and not a gym. He wore a gray Henley, work pants, and steel-toed boots that had been resoled at least once. Behind him, the passenger door opened and a small boy, 5, maybe 6 years old, climbed down from the cab with the careful deliberateness of a child who had done this 1,000 times and knew not to rush it. The boy carried a dinosaur backpack. Elara, watching from the front window, felt the faint beginnings of doubt. She opened the door before he knocked. "Mrs. Dunmore?" He extended his hand, then seemed to register something and shifted his weight, glancing briefly at her right hand. Not in the way that made her want to close the door. Just noticing, recalibrating the way a competent person noticed the conditions of a job site before starting work. "Rowan Salt, this is my son, Henri. I tried to arrange childcare for today and it fell through. I should have called ahead. If it's an issue, I can reschedule." "It's not an issue," she said, surprising herself slightly. She looked at the boy. He had his father's dark eyes and was studying the entryway with the focused attention of someone conducting an independent assessment. "Is he going to touch things?" "Henry," Rowan said. "I won't touch things," Henri said seriously, "unless they're interesting." "Most things in this house are interesting," Elara said. "You can sit in the front room. There are books on the lower shelves. The ones with the blue spines are for people your age." Henry considered this. "How do you know what age I am?" "I don't. But you can tell me if I'm wrong." He followed her inside without further negotiation, which she respected. Rowan Salt had been recommended by a building contractor in the annex who had done work on Meridian's office space 2 years prior. The recommendation had been brief. "He's quiet, he's thorough, and he knows residential elevator systems better than anyone I've met. Had some trouble a few years back, family stuff, not professional. Worth your time." She hadn't asked about the trouble. It wasn't her business. What she noticed, watching him work through the morning, was that he moved through her house with a particular kind of respectfulness. Not deferential, not nervous, but careful in the way that people are careful around things they understand to have value. He asked before he opened panels. He photographed everything before he touched it. When he found the problem, a failed hydraulic seal compounded by a secondary electrical fault in the control board, he came to find her in the kitchen rather than calling out, and he laid his tablet on the counter with the photographs arranged in sequence so she could see exactly what he was looking at. The seal failure is straightforward, he said. 2-3 hours. Parts I have in the truck. The control board is a different situation. This is the original unit. It's about 15 years old, and whoever serviced it last did a patch job here that was never meant to be permanent. He pointed to a section of the photograph. It's been running on that patch for, I'd estimate, 2 to 3 years. Could have failed any time in that window. Why didn't it? Luck, and probably low usage. Did you use this elevator often before recently? She noticed the pause. Before my diagnosis, no. The stairs were faster. After, yes. He nodded. That explains the timing. Increased load on a compromised system. What did the previous service company tell you when they looked at it? Rowan was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer. It was the quiet of someone deciding how much of an answer to give. The previous company didn't note the control board issue in their service report, he said. The report from 8 months ago shows a clean inspection. 8 months ago, around the time her diagnosis had been formalized. Around the time she had started using the elevator regularly. She looked at the photograph on his tablet for a long moment. Rowan, she said, who did the previous company send? She found out who had hired them at dinner that same evening, which was not a dinner she had planned to attend. Her brother Callum, no, not Callum, her cousin Denton had called that afternoon. Denton Ashmore, who held the title of Chief Operating Officer at Meridian Capital, and who had been angling for a buyout of Elara's controlling shares for the better part of 2 years. He called to check in, he said, to see how the house repairs were going. To remind her, in the smooth, practiced way he had always reminded her of things, that the shareholder meeting was in 6 weeks and that the board was eager to see a clear succession plan articulated. Succession plan, at 41. I'm aware of the meeting, Denton, she said. Of course you are. I just want to make sure you're not overextending yourself, given everything. There it was. She had grown up with Denton. She had brought him into the firm 12 years ago because he was smart, and she had trusted him, and because at the time she had not yet learned the particular lesson that family loyalty and professional loyalty were not the same currency. She was learning it now. After the call, she sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on any lights. Rowan had left at 4 to get Henri home for dinner, with a quiet, "I'll be back Thursday with the parts," that had felt more like a statement than a question. The house was very still. From down the hall, she could hear the hum of the refrigerator, and faintly, the sound of rain beginning against the back windows. She picked up her phone and called her head of compliance. Thursday came, and Rowan came with it, and Henri, who had apparently decided that the front room with the blue-spined books was a satisfactory environment, and settled into it within 4 minutes of arrival with the self-contained ease of a child, accustomed to waiting in unfamiliar places. Rowan worked. Elara worked. By mid-morning, she had moved her laptop to the dining room table. Closer to the kitchen, closer to the ongoing quiet noise of someone who knew what they were doing, and found, to her mild surprise, that it was easier to concentrate than it usually was. She was used to the silence of the house pressing in. This was a different kind of quiet. It had weight and direction. At 11:30, Rowan appeared in the doorway. "Can I show you something?" She followed him to the elevator shaft. What he showed her was not the control board. The control board was fixed, sitting neatly in its housing, with new components and clean wiring. What he showed her was behind it, a section of the secondary wiring run that connected the elevator system to the house's main electrical panel. In that run, tucked behind a bracket in a way that would only be visible if you removed the entire access panel rather than just the service hatch, was a junction that should not have existed. An additional circuit wired in parallel that drew a small, consistent current from the elevator's emergency stop mechanism. "This bypasses the safety interlock," Rowan said. He kept his voice level and technical. What it means practically is that under certain load conditions, heavier use, extended operation, the emergency brake can be triggered remotely, or it can be prevented from triggering when it should. The rain outside had gotten heavier. She could hear it on the roof. "That's not a manufacturing defect," she said. "No. And it wasn't in the original installation. I pulled the original specs from the manufacturer's archive. It's not in the original." She looked at the junction, small, unremarkable, neatly made. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Someone had taken their time. "How long has this been here?" "Based on the oxidation on the solder points and the condition of the wire jacket, I'd say somewhere between 8 and 14 months. She did the math without trying to. The timeline settled over her like cold water. "Rowan," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right. Have you ever seen something like this before? In a residential property?" He was quiet for a moment, that same deliberate quiet she had started to recognize as the pause before precision. "Once," he said, "in Montreal, 6 years ago. I was working a site and I found a gas line junction that had been partially crimped. Not enough to cause an immediate leak, enough that over time, under pressure it would." He paused. "I reported it. There was an investigation. And the owner of the property recovered. The person who had installed the junction did not fare as well legally." He looked at her directly. "I know what you're asking me. Yes, I've seen deliberate sabotage in a residential context before. This looks like deliberate sabotage." She nodded slowly. "Then I need you to not touch anything else," she said, "and I need to make a phone call." The phone call was not to the police. Elara had spent 11 years in private equity. She knew that the moment you involved uniformed officers in a corporate dispute, because that was what this was, whatever its physical form, you lost control of the narrative, the timing, and frequently the outcome. She called instead her firm's head of legal, a compact and relentless woman named Sybil, who had once described her approach to corporate litigation as archaeological. You dig carefully, and then you bring down the whole site at once. Sybil listened without interrupting. "I need everything on the service company," Elara said. "Who owns it? Who engaged them? Who signed the authorization to allow access to the property? And I need the board's communications from the past 18 months. Specifically anything touching on the succession discussions and the Ashmore proposal. That's a significant request. Denton has been pushing for a competency review," Elara said. "Not publicly. Through the board channels, quietly. The kind of thing that gains traction if the CEO starts having accidents." Silence on the line. "I'll need 48 hours, Sybil said. "You have 36. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. From the front room, she could hear the faint sound of Henri reading aloud to himself. Quietly, one word at a time, with the careful seriousness of a child who was still making friends with reading. From the east wing, she could hear Rowan photographing every centimeter of the junction, methodical and unhurried, documenting everything without being asked. She had not asked him to stay. He had simply understood that staying was the right thing to do. The next 36 hours were not dramatic in the way that dramatic things usually presented themselves. There were no confrontations, no raised voices. What there was instead was the quiet, painstaking work of assembling a case the way you assembled anything that was meant to hold weight, from the foundation up, with nothing left to chance. Sybil's team found that the elevator service company had been incorporated 14 months ago, with a numbered holding company as its sole shareholder. The numbered company resolved, through 2 layers of incorporation, to a property management firm in which Denton Ashmore held a 30% stake. They found the authorization form for property access, signed not by Elara's household manager, as protocol required, but by Denton himself, using an authorization he had no standing to give and that Elara had never signed. They found 3 years of internal board communications in which Denton had systematically positioned Elara's diagnosis as a governance liability, never directly, always through implication, always through careful forwarded articles and concerned questions raised in closed sessions. And they found, in a chain of messages between Denton and 2 board members, a reference to the timeline accelerating, following what was described as the physical situation resolving itself. Elara read that phrase sitting at her dining room table at 2 in the morning in the quiet house, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She read it twice. Then she set the tablet down and looked out the dark window for a while. She had known Denton for 37 years. She had trusted him for 35 of them. There was grief in that. She allowed herself to feel it briefly, the way you might allow yourself to feel the cold before you went back inside. Then she picked up her phone and called Sybil. "Bring it to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit," she said. "Not local police. Federal, that's what I'd recommend. And Sybil, I want to be at the board meeting next week. In person. I want to chair it." A pause. "Are you sure that's—" "I've been running this company for 11 years, Elara said. "I'm going to be there." She was there. The boardroom at Meridian Capital occupied the northeast corner of the 22nd floor of a King Street tower, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake on clear days and over a flat gray expanse of cloud on days like this one. A mid-November Tuesday, with a kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and resignation. Elara arrived early. She sat at the head of the table and arranged her materials with the help of her assistant, and she waited. The board members filed in one by one. She watched their faces as they registered her presence, each reaction a small data point. The genuine surprise from the two members she trusted, the careful neutrality from the ones she didn't. The barely perceptible calculation from the two who had exchanged messages with Denton about timelines and physical situations. Denton was last. He came through the door talking, something about traffic, about the weather, about parking, and then he saw her and he stopped. Elara. He smiled. It was a good smile. It had always been a good smile. "I didn't know you were feeling up to." "Sit down, Denton," she said. The smile held for a moment longer than was natural. Then he sat. She had thought about what she would feel in this moment. She had expected anger. What she found instead was something colder and more precise. The same quality of attention she brought to a balance sheet that wasn't adding up. The same absolute clarity about where the error was and what it would cost. "We're going to conduct this meeting in a slightly different order than the circulated agenda," she said. "Before we discuss the succession proposal, I'd like to read the board something." She read them the message about the timeline accelerating. She read them the message about the physical situation resolving itself. She told them, in clear and specific terms, what had been found in the elevator shaft of her home, who owned the company that had installed it, and how that company connected to a member of this board. She did not raise her voice once. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, the November sky had finally made up its mind and started to rain. Denton said, "Elara, you have to understand." "Sybil," Elara said. The door opened. Sybil entered with two RCMP officers in plain clothes and a man from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit whom Elara had spoken to 4 days ago, and who carried a very specific kind of document. Denton's lawyer had been contacted 40 minutes ago. Denton had not been. The board members who had exchanged messages with Denton learned in that moment that their own legal counsel had also been notified, and that cooperation would be looked upon considerably more favorably than the alternative. The hands that went up, in acknowledgement, in the formal board vote that followed after the officers had escorted Denton from the room, went up quickly. The air in the room felt different afterward, lighter in the way rooms feel after something heavy has been carried out of them. Elara sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she picked up her notes and began the rest of the meeting. She told Rowan about it the following Saturday, which was not something she had planned to do. He had come back to complete the remaining cosmetic work in the elevator housing. The kind of finishing that the technical repair hadn't covered, and Henri had come with him again and resumed his position in the front room with the blue-spined books as though it were a standing arrangement. At some point mid-morning, Elara had found herself making sandwiches for 3 without having consciously decided to do so, which was unusual for her in a way she chose not to examine too closely. They sat at the kitchen table. Henri ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had opinions about food, but had learned to keep them mostly internal. Outside, the backyard was bare with November, the maple tree at the property line reduced to its essential shape. Rowan listened to the whole account without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not that must have been difficult. Not I can't imagine." Just the direct question, asked in the same way he asked questions about load-bearing walls and wiring runs, as though the answer mattered and he intended to take it seriously. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I will be." He nodded. "The company," she said, "Meridian, we have a division that's been looking at adaptive technology, accessibility systems for residential and commercial properties. It's been underfunded because Denton managed the capital allocation for the past 3 years and he had other priorities." She paused. "I need someone to run it, someone who understands the systems from the ground up, not just the investment thesis." Rowan looked at her steadily. "I'm a contractor," he said. "You were also?" "According to the reference I finally looked up properly. A systems engineer with 12 years of experience at Demers Mechanical before you left to start your own practice." She met his eyes. "The woman who recommended you described it as family stuff." "I'm not asking about the family stuff. I'm asking if you'd consider sitting down with me and our technology lead to talk about the division." Henry, without looking up from his sandwich, said, "Dad's really good at fixing things." "I know," Elara said. Rowan looked at his son. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "I'd consider it," he said. "A conversation. That's all I'm asking for." Outside, the maple tree stood bare and still in the late autumn light. On the counter, Elara's compression glove lay beside her coffee cup, where she had set it down without thinking. Because somewhere in the last hour, she had stopped being careful about what he would think when he saw it. That was not nothing. She poured more coffee. The house was warm. Henri turned a page. The afternoon settled around the three of them, without ceremony, without rush, the way good things sometimes do, quietly, before you've quite noticed they've begun.